Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for attending. I don't believe we have anybody here from the public, either online or behind me. So we have a lot of new faces in the room. So I don't know if it was me. I like to go around and everybody introduce themselves before we start into doing the next step. Okay.
Hi, my name is Carson. I'm the new transportation planner for the Westwood District for VDOT.
Del Bishop, I'm the Director of Planning and Zoning in Nelson.
I'm Senior Planner for Louisa and Chairman of RTAC.
Troy Austin with VDOT. I'm the Operations Director for Public District.
I'm Josh Gillespie. I'm the Community Development Director for Louisa County.
Jason Overstreet for that.
Ben Chambers and Transportation Planning Manager in the City of Charlotte.
I'm Eric Green Blunt. I'm the Transportation Planner for Albemarle.
I'm Baby Lacy, I'm the Transit Planner.
Eric Eustace with Kinley Horn.
Danielle McRae with Kinley Horn.
Mark Herman with Kinley Horn.
Sandy Shackelford, TJPDC.
Curtis Gripping-Addo, TJPDC.
And
Lucinda Shannon, TJPDC.
And then it looks like we can see everybody online here. Does anybody have any comments on the minutes from the last meeting or any edits that they'd like to make? In that case, I motion to approve them. I'm looking for a second.
Second.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. And so approved. All right, we're going along. VDOT safety data. I'm looking forward to hearing about this.
Do you want to do an introduction?
Oh, well, yeah. Well, we're happy to have Kimberly Horn here with us today. Sorry, I was just gonna let them be self-sufficient, but we could also be welcoming. So just to give you a little bit of context, Kimberly Horn has been retained through the VDOT Highway Safety Improvement Program. They have some funding available that localities or regions can take advantage of through that program in order to can you minimize the participant information to support sort of the understanding of safety risks throughout the community. So we are in the very fortunate circumstance that not only is Kimberly Horn our consultant for VDOT with this process, but this is also some of the same team members who are actually going to be supporting our Safe Streets and Roads for All grant through the US DOT grant as well. So we're very fortunate that we're able to have some alignment between these two efforts and have some coordination among our consultant team. So Mark is the project lead as far as the VDOT scope of work is concerned, and then Daniela and Aaron are also managing our scope of work through the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant. So does that cover it? Yeah.
You guys spoke long enough for me to figure out why my computer is blinking. So yeah, I'm kind of playing a dual role today here on behalf of the support that VDOT is providing, but also as part of the project team from Kinley Horn. So we're going to do a brief introduction to the SS4A Safety Action Plan as a whole, but then start to talk a little bit about some very initial data analysis that we have done and try to establish some emphasis areas and talk about ideas to figure out what our priorities are going to be for this plan moving forward. We don't have to have everything figured out today, but at least enough ideas and talking points that we can go back and refine our data analysis and come back to you with more numbers. So we'll talk a little bit about the general approach for the plan, walk through those initial data findings and have that discussion, and we can circle back and talk about what's next. So to start, for anyone that isn't familiar with SS4A, Safe Streets for All, so it is a new program through Federal Highway. It was established as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, and it's funding $5 billion worth of projects from 2022 to 2026. The goal of the program as a whole is to help reduce the number of deaths and serious injuries that are occurring on roadways throughout the US. There are two main types of grants. So what we are doing as part of this is a planning and demonstration grant, which is going to be to help develop a comprehensive safety action plan. So as part of that is going to be looking at what are current issues and then identifying a set of improvements that moving forward we will look to identify funding and implement in the coming years. Now, any improvements that are identified as part of this plan, we don't have to go back to FHWA to fund, but the other part of the SS4A funding that is available is for implementation grants. So for the improvements that we identify as part of this plan, we are then eligible, because we have completed the plan, to then go back and apply for funding specific to those improvements. But again, there are other opportunities to fund or implement improvements, not just the FHWA funding. So in terms of the components of a plan, so what we have on this left side are the components that are required as part of FHWA for a safety action plan. And this is where because I'm kind of here representing VDOT and then also representing the Kinley Horn team, there's a little bit of gray area, but in terms of the support that VDOT has offered to the PDC, it is to cover a few different portions of the safety action plan. So the first is the safety analysis. So we will be working with you all to go and analyze data, identify emphasis areas or priority areas for the plan moving forward, and then really focus on high crash locations and where we might be able to implement projects. We'll have some engagement with you all as part of the VDOT effort, with the public. That will be more for the full plan effort moving forward. And then the other part is that we will be incorporating the federal highway data sets on underserved communities to understand what percentage of crashes are occurring in underserved communities, so that once we get to the identification of improvements, we can have that in mind to make sure that the improvement set is equitable. Otherwise, a few other key parts of the plan as a whole. So it will involve a commitment from leadership, so from the PDC and the member jurisdictions, to either commit to achieving a zero number or a significant reduction. So when we have a full kickoff for the plan as a whole, we'll look to engage that leadership to make sure that we can look forward to that commitment. And then the end goal for this project is really that set of improvements that we will identify and then prioritize to then figure out now, once we have that set of improvements moving forward, how can we potentially implement or fund those improvements to really see progress on safety in the next few years. Any questions on the overall process or what is going to be included in the plan? All right. So Danielle also joined, and so she is going to be the Kinley Horn project manager for the full effort moving forward. So she wanted to do a little bit of an introduction to the full effort.
And we look forward, thank you, Mark. We look forward to partnering with this group and others on the full comprehensive regional plan. I wanted to mention that we are partnered, Kinley Horn's also partnered with AdvoCorps, and there's a very robust effort for public engagement and community engagement and buy-in as part of this planning process. That's very important as we move forward and at the ultimate end identify projects that you will seek federal funding for. And so what we've included here is a list of the engagement efforts that we will look to partner with you on and your communities. We're going to kick off this effort more formally with a regional road safety summit, and that will include you and some leadership from different jurisdictions, from your different member jurisdictions. And that's where we'll look to provide education, more in-depth education on the 4 E's, and also look for that buy-in from leadership so that we can establish some goals and that leadership commitment early on in the process. So that's the more formal kickoff. I just wanted to make you aware of that. Once the date is set, we will invite all of you and your member organizations. Other elements of the engagement process include stakeholder meetings, a public survey, which we will use to disseminate within the community to identify issues and opportunities. We will leverage community champions and identify those community champions from different jurisdictions to help us really connect with communities and make sure we're getting the word out, spreading the word, and also hearing back from members in the community. Mark mentioned, actually, I don't remember what you mentioned. There was something you mentioned. The equity considerations and the underserved communities. Those community champions will also look to identify groups that are maybe not represented most often to make sure we're connecting with them. They will be equipped with outreach toolkits. So our team, in partnership with AdvoCorps, will develop a toolkit of information that will be disseminated to the community. And so our community champions will be armed with information so that they can bring us back some insight to inform the plan. We also are hosting community pop-up meetings within the 6 different jurisdictions, and so we'll partner with your jurisdictions to identify those locations, and we'll facilitate in-person public meetings. So there's a lot happening as part of this plan. Unique to the city of Charlottesville, we will have a charrette and a demonstration project. So that's a full list of engagement elements that are outside of what Mark is discussing today, but as part of the broader safety action plan. And the next slide, we have just a snapshot of the technical components of this work and the process that we'll need to execute over the next 18 to 24 months to meet an end goal of June 2025 with ultimate adoption of the safety action plan. And so we are looking at 3 different rounds of public engagement, first with identifying issues and values for each of the 6 different communities. And then all of the public engagement will be used to inform our technical analysis, inform and validate the vast amount of data that we're analyzing. The second round of engagement will be used to prioritize and identify strategies to address those issues identified as part of the analysis. And then the third round of engagement is really where we will have a preview of the draft plan and give the public an opportunity to provide feedback. So this is just a layout of the general approach of how our technical analysis and engagement will be running parallel.
Quick question, county, will you be looking for county board of supervisors and town council to adopt through a resolution supporting what the end product of this is going to be in order for it to be adopted at a statewide level? Or, as I mentioned, that you're looking for some consensus earlier.
Yes, there will be some consensus at the leadership level. Sandy, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, we are going to be, at the end of this, basically this isn't necessarily going to be adopted at the state level. This is going to be, having the adopted plan would make us potentially, one, it would show a commitment by each locality in the region to, you know, the objectives and the goals and priorities that were identified here. The second thing it would do though is you now have an adopted, eligible comprehensive safety action plan that would allow you to apply for implementation funding through a future Safe Streets and Roads for All grant application.
Follow-up, would we have to adopt that plan into our comprehensive plan to use it, or just have it?
I don't know that you have to adopt it into your comprehensive plan, but you would have to adopt it. The board or council would have to adopt it.
Right,
Yeah.
it can be a standalone. It just has to be completed. So FHWA knows that there has been an effort done to look at existing problems, identify projects, and that has been completed to understand that if you are seeking funding for individual projects later, that there's a basis for how those were identified.
Thank you.
This will look like the implementation grants, when they typically be let. I'm thinking about the summer 2025 date, and then realizing the funding program is 26. So is summer 25, will the community at least get 2 rounds of grants in?
That's our intention.
Because it's like, it's in the fall when the intake of those are, something like that.
The call for the notice for a funding opportunity is typically in August or September. And so the hope is that by June 2025, you have that adopted plan. and that prepares you to go into your implementation round.
Right, so they at least get 2 shots at the
Yes.
implementation grants. Okay, thanks.
Follow-up question, do you know if the next 2 rounds of Smart Scale will be asking questions related to, do you have one of these plans, and is it subject to the project that you're applying for? That's 2 parts.
This is separate from Smart Scale. Smart Scale is not related to this at all. So there might be projects that are identified in this that aren't eligible Smart Scale projects, for example.
Yeah,
And works with maybe the PTs and stuff.
That's all that's all I had to, are there any other questions? One more thing, I guess I should say, to your question about Smart Scale, we would encourage you to seek out as much funding as there's available, right? So this sort of plan will set you up for success with future federal funding and also other pots of money, so, yeah.
All right. So starting off with just some definitions, if you have not heard of the CAPCO scale before, we will refer to it quite a bit. It is how crash data is defined based on the severity level. So the K is going to be your fatal crashes. My kind of trick for remembering what these letters stand for. K is for killed. At least one person died in the crash. A is going to be your most serious type of injury that did not result in a fatality. So A typically involves an ambulance arriving on scene and transporting someone from the crash. B and C are also injury crashes, just not quite as severe, not rising to the level that require an ambulance. An easy way to remember, B is some type of visible injury that is experienced, so you can think B as in bruise. And C is a possible non-visible injury, so you can think of it as a complaint. Someone might be complaining of whiplash or a headache, but it's not something that you can see and comment on, but also, an injury resulting from that crash. And then O is your property damage only crashes. This is the highest percentage of crashes that occur on our roadways, but when we talk safety and really identifying safety improvements, the goal is to reduce the number of fatality and injury related crashes. A reduction in PDO crashes is an extra benefit, but it's not the main focus of the plan. And from the federal highway level and other VDOT safety planning efforts typically focus just on your fatalities and your A injury level crashes. So what I talked through today, we are just going to be focusing on the Ks and As. However, once we get into the plan, because we have a mix of urban and rural and the number of crashes in the various jurisdictions is going to differ, we are going to include the B and C crashes where it makes sense, especially as we develop a high injury network. A high injury network is really identifying the percentage of your roadways that experience the most injury crashes. And so in a more urban area where you may have a higher density of fatalities and serious injuries, we may only need to look at Ks and As. In a more rural area where those crashes may be spread out, to really develop that high injury network, we may then also include the Bs. So I want to make sure everyone has a good understanding of what these mean, because it'll, as we go into the more detailed analysis and develop that high injury network, it'll be a little bit different criteria for the various jurisdictions based off of the density of crashes that do occur. So jumping into some data, I wanted to start with just a picture of what is happening statewide, just to have some context to see how what's happening in this region can compare. Looking at the fatality chart, so 2014 is kind of the break point where the state had hit a low point, really as long as crash data has been checked, 703 was that low point in the number of fatalities that occurred in 1 year. However, you can see that since 2014, those fatalities have started to increase on a yearly basis. In 2022, that number jumped above 1,000 for the first time since 2007. So it's a trend that is very much going in the wrong direction on the statewide level, and really on the national level as well. What is really kind of the most disconcerting part of that trend is prior to 2014, with the exception of a little bit of fluctuation year over year, in general, it had been a constant downward trend with the improvements in vehicle technology, vehicle safety, improvements to roads, really across the whole spectrum of roadway safety. That number had constantly been decreasing, except for the past 8 years. For serious injuries, again, that's our A-level injury, ambulance involved. Up until 2014, we had a pretty steady downward trend. And while it still has decreased a little bit since 2014, it has really leveled off. That rate of decrease has slowed down. So not as problematic as what we're seeing with the increasing fatalities, but it's still not as pretty of a picture as it was before, where we were making strides year over year.
What is the amount of increase in terms of is it follow that same trend that it levels out, or are more of them shifting to minor injuries because
So in a couple of slides, I have what it looks like on a regional basis, and the tough part is that the definition changed a little bit a few years ago, and so you'll see when I get there, there's a pretty significant jump in B crashes with a decrease in Cs related to the definition. And so it's a little bit more difficult to track the trend over time because there were more significant changes in how that data is classified.
Mark, from what I had noticed with looking at the crashes over the district, you can see basically from 2008, 2009, 2020, it's relatively low. It's around that 800 fatalities a year. When the pandemic hit, what we saw is such a reduction in volumes on the road, but we saw much worse driving behavior. We saw a lot more speeding. We saw a lot more distracted driving, driving under the influence, not wearing seatbelts. And that's the reason I think you see that big jump is largely associated with that change in driver behavior in 2020. And it just kept getting worse. We're still experiencing a lot of that. So I'm suspecting that is a lot of what's going on with these numbers.
It was definitely a big contributing factor in 2020, especially with vehicle speed. Because for that pandemic year, we had an increase in 19 fatalities from 2019 to 2020. We did see a drop in serious injuries, and that was more likely tied to the decreasing volume on the roadways. I think a lot of the conversations that are happening on the statewide level are related to the fact that the numbers are still increasing, even though the VMT and volume on our roadways has started to rebound, and many locations is back at or above pre-pandemic levels. So I know a lot of that conversation is still ongoing. I can tell you from 2021 to 2022 on the statewide level, so overall the fatalities increased by about 40. The number of pedestrian fatalities jumped by 50 from 2021 to 2022 on a statewide level. So overall, if you excluded pedestrian fatalities, it stayed rarely level, but there's a big focus on the statewide level for the safety team at central office to figure out, well, what caused that increase? So there's the tough part is with anything on our roadways and crash data, there's very rarely one and only factor that causes a crash. There are a multitude of things. You have one driver exhibiting one behavior, one driver exhibiting another, and that plus the roadway environment, weather, there's a lot of things that can go into it.
Changing driver behavior is the hardest thing to do in attempting to try and reduce fatal crashes. You can change road engineering and the quality impacting driver behavior is the tough one.
And what we typically, what you'll hear throughout this plan is that we talk about 4 E's of roadway safety. So engineering is one of the E's, but then the others are education, enforcement, and emergency response. And so the goal is that if you can make improvements across any of those 4 E's, you are making progress towards safer roadways. For the first 3, they tend to be more proactive type improvements. And then emergency response is more on the, okay, well, we recognize that crashes are still going to happen. If we can improve response times, improve the level of care that can be provided, that we may not reduce the number of crashes, but we may be able to reduce the number of injuries suffered as a result of them. And so, yeah, education is a big part of it, but I mean, I have experienced and witnessed, I'm sure you all have as well, drivers are speeding more so than ever before. Drivers are running red lights more so than ever before. The amount of people that I drive by that are on their phone, either talking, texting, being distracted by some other reason, that continues to increase. So it's definitely a huge contributing factor, but as part of this plan, we can put some effort to focusing on education type improvements that can be shared in the region to help address that as well. So let's take a look at trends in the region and can kind of compare back and forth. Looking within the PDC boundaries, so the low point in fatalities actually occurred 2 years after that statewide low in 2016. And one thing I will say, anytime you look down on a regional or jurisdictional level, you're always going to see a little bit more fluctuation than you would on a statewide level. So that's perfectly normal to see. But the fatality trend is pretty similar in the fact that it was overall decreasing year over year, in this case until 2016, and then it really has started to increase since then. We just didn't see that same jump in 2022 that the statewide numbers showed. However, when we're looking at serious injuries, we did see a consistent drop down till 2014. What's a little bit different than what we see on the statewide levels, instead of leveling off and still having slight decreases, that trend has actually started to increase. And then just looking at one other way to visualize this while adding in the B and C injuries, and Ben, you had asked about trends on the statewide level. So right about 2012 is when there was a change. So that's where you see there's a big increase in the number of B injuries, but a big decrease in the number of C injuries. So that's attributed to how that data was defined. However, there is also a big jump in I think it's 2018 in the C injuries, and this is something that we actually are seeing in a few other PDCs that VDOT is providing support. I don't have a direct answer as to what caused that increase in 2018 yet, but we're looking into to figure out what caused that. Just on a jurisdiction level, this plan, we are going to be developing a high injury network within each jurisdiction that then rolls up into a regional high injury network. And so looking at numbers, so I mentioned that in the more rural areas, we may be looking at more crash types to be considered. So looking at the number of fatalities that are occurring in Fluvanna and Greene County, and I advance one slide to see, the number of serious injuries are also lower in those areas. That is likely where we're going to go to the next level and at least include those B-level crashes when we're developing that network. And I don't think anything on this slide should be super surprising to those in the room who, know this area better than I do, but the fact that Albemarle County has the highest number, I hope that's not a surprise to anyone here.
It's the highest population.
Also surprised that the city doesn't have more.
I think Louisa sticks out. I wonder if that's.
They're the largest rural locality, so this isn't standardized by population, yeah. What's Louisa's population?
It's about 39,000. I mean, I would be interested if you, and I'm waiting to see if you're gonna go there, to look at the interstate travel versus the primary, secondary roads. Because obviously the interstate has high potential for everyone.
I can tell you from reviewing the crashes in Culpeper District, the interstate tends to have fewer fatalities than the primaries. Especially considering the traffic volumes that you see on the interstate. Yeah, you have potential because of speeds, but for whatever reason, fatalities aren't happening as frequently on the interstate. They do happen, but not as frequently as on some of the primary roads.
And that is something that is true outside of Culpeper too. It's I think people think of the interstates because of the speed and more so because just the volume of vehicles traveling on them on a daily basis that you see more fatalities happen, but on a rate basis, interstate facilities tend to be one of the safest. Other than, I mean, your local roads where speed limits and the 25, 30 miles per hour are gonna have, way fewer just because of that speed component. But when you're comparing an interstate to a primary at 55 or a secondary road, that the interstate is going to be safer on a rate basis, but just with all of that travel, that number adds up.
Yeah, I wonder if VDOT, are you guys sort of segregating out accidents that occur on the right side of the road versus someone running off on the left side of the road? Something that I realized just traveling in North Carolina is that one difference between the two states roadway systems, that in Virginia, there's no left shoulder. It's like you just have the edge of the road and then you have the median or a guardrail, there's no shoulder. And in North Carolina, it's not really like that. So I know that crashing is being looked at from how folks are running off the edge of the road and then just the left shoulder.
Yeah, it is something that is looked at. So, and we'll get to our emphasis areas, but one of the statewide emphasis areas is roadway departure crashes. And so within that, the data can be defined as departing the roadway to the right or the left. So we'll talk about roadway departures as a potential emphasis area moving forward as part of this plan, but we do have the data available to dig down to that level. So we're not having that in the presentation today to be able to talk to, but the data is available if we get to that level.
I would say one observation, I think we saw that in the data, is just looking at Nelson County, it's a little bit higher than Greene and Fluvanna, which is also, I think, notable because Nelson County actually has the smallest population.
It has 29 that runs through it.
Right. You have a lot of things to look at.
Yeah.
Opportunity to park the roadway there for sure.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to switch gears and start to talk a little bit about emphasis areas. So emphasis areas we use as a way to define the primary areas that we will focus our efforts for the next 5 years as part of this plan. There are a few different ways to think about how to develop them, but in general, we kind of came up with a few ways to organize your thoughts about that. So one is what areas are contributors to the frequency of crashes. So a couple of examples, an intersection provides a place where vehicles interact. Because it creates that conflict point, it creates a potential for a crash to occur. More behavioral type factors, things that drivers may be doing, if they are speeding, if they are distracted, the more often you are exhibiting poor behavior, the more likely you are to be involved in a crash. Second way is factors that contribute to higher crash severities. So I mentioned speeding. Speeding kind of blurs the line between these first two boxes here, but if a crash occurs at higher speed, it is more likely to result in a more serious injury. Similarly, seatbelt use. If you are driving without wearing your seatbelt, it's not increasing your chances of being involved in a crash. But if you are involved in a crash, it really increases the chances that you are hurt or seriously injured. The third way that you can think about it is focusing on either a user type or a vehicle type that is involved in a number of crashes. So thinking about pedestrians, bicyclists, motorcyclists, young drivers, older drivers have different issues that might make them more likely to be involved in a crash than others. On the vehicle side, you can look at the challenges of heavy vehicles or large trucks on our roadway system and how other vehicles interact with them. And then we mentioned roadway departures already, but you can also look at a crash type and trying to address a crash type that may be more problematic in your area. And so in general, we are going to be looking to establish a list of emphasis areas for this plan. And so what do we want to consider as we're establishing them? Well, one thing that we can look at is the statewide priorities. And my next slide will talk about what emphasis areas we have used on a statewide basis. But that does not mean that if it's a statewide priority, it is a priority within TJPDC. So we have the flexibility to remove a statewide priority if we don't consider it a major problem in this area. We have the option to add something else to the list if it's something that we want to consider. And so, well, the goal of today is to have some of that discussion, right? Of what are your priorities? What things do we want to consider as part of this plan? So a few questions that you can ask are, what areas, and is that a user type? Is it a type of crash? Is it a behavior that is that has a lot of crashes occurring within this region? Another question is there an area where the number of crashes is increasing year over year, so it's a trend that you are trying to reverse? Or the third is there an area that you can see the region achieving success in reducing fatalities and serious injuries? So even if it's not the highest from a numbers perspective in terms of how many crashes occurring, if there are other efforts within the region that are geared towards pedestrian access or bicycle access, even if there aren't a lot of bicycle fatalities, it may be a good idea to still have that be a focus as part of this plan, because it is aligning with other priorities. So before I talk about what those statewide priorities are, does anyone have any questions about really what I want you to all be thinking about as we establish the emphasis areas?
One thing I'll just mention is I know a lot of the localities have seen serious crashes this year. That is not necessarily going to be captured in this. So if you're aware of those crashes that aren't reflected in the data as we talk about that, that might also be good feedback to be providing.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Everything that we have is we typically use 5 years of complete data. So everything that I'm sharing in the next few slides is going to be 2018 through 2022. So anything that has happened since then, feel free to share, but it just won't be reflected. Yeah.
Hey, Mark, this is a subset of the roadway departures, but the single vehicle incidents, I think, are noteworthy. And it speaks to the bad behaviors of, many of the things that you talked about earlier as contributing factors. But I think as a data point, to just bring that forward, there's an opportunity for education there, which it does, right? VDOT does it well. But I think that's something that is important to highlight in this kind of analysis is going to be the crashes.
Okay. Yeah, and it's a good comment because a lot of that does get captured in roadway departures. But when we talk about emphasis areas, there's often a discussion that needs to happen as to whether or not you should be establishing a new emphasis area or having a question like that kind of be a way to narrow in within an existing one. And so it's something we can definitely look at numbers for. Then it's just a matter of what is the best way to organize it within this plan to lead to a set of improvements.
Also, a point of clarification, does this data analysis include crashes that occur on private roads or private road networks?
It is, let's see.
You probably pulled that far 300s from the, that has some crashes that are on private roads, but not all of them.
Okay.
Occasionally they'll show up on the database. I do know that.
Right. So that might be something else just to be screening for, especially in Fluvanna.
Yeah, there's probably some in there, but it's not, I don't think it's something that you can screen out and say, yeah, we have all these crashes on private roads. It's just kind of a fluke thing.
Okay.
So the statewide emphasis area, so every 5 years, the state has to complete a strategic highway safety plan. In Virginia, this has always been a collaborative effort that has been led by VDOT, but has included several other state agencies. Because we talk about safety being a part of the 4 E's, VDOT has led the plan from an engineering perspective, but we've had involvement from the Highway Safety Office at the DMV, from the Department of Education, the Department of Health, from the state police and various other police departments to try to create a comprehensive plan with the goal of reducing the number of fatalities and serious injuries in the state. And so as part of that, we do have a set of emphasis areas that we have used. So the current version of the SHSP is for 2022 through 2026. So the development happened in 2020 and 2021. And with the idea of those actions are then implemented in the 5-year span of 22 through 26. And the emphasis, what we have on screen is the emphasis areas. They are sorted into the different elements of the safe system approach, which is a more holistic way of viewing safety. Some of the main priorities of the safe system approach is to recognize that crashes are going to happen and that humans make mistakes, but it's about designing a roadway network that is forgiving for those mistakes. And so it kind of focuses on, right, the goal is to try to prevent crashes where possible, but then recognizes that they're going to happen and making sure that you have a network to accommodate that. So the safe system element, it focuses on improvements for improving the behavior of road users, improving the safety of vehicles themselves, trying to control speed as best as possible, and then improving the roadways and the post-crash care that is used to respond to crashes. So what falls under the safe system approach and under those safe system elements are the emphasis areas. So across the board, pedestrian and bicyclists, what we did on the statewide level was analyze data separately for pedestrians and bicyclists, but a lot of the countermeasures that we looked at really overlap the two, so we kind of treat them as one, even though we analyzed the data separately. We also looked at, from a safe road user perspective, crashes involving young drivers, aging or older drivers, which there are, very different issues contributing to crashes with a young driver versus an older driver. Occupant protection is seatbelt use. Impaired driving, we talk about that being the 4 Ds. So it is drunk driving, distracted driving, drowsy driving, and drugged driving. And then crashes involving motorcyclists also. Moving down to that bottom row, under safe vehicles, we looked at crashes involving heavy vehicles. It's a little misleading where it is placed because with heavy vehicles, it's really a lot of our improvements are focused on how non-heavy vehicles, how passenger vehicles interact with larger trucks. It's very rarely the large truck driver's fault in a crash. But then we also had improvements that were focused on working hours of truck drivers and things to make sure that they are rested so that they are also then exhibiting good behavior while they are driving.
Mark, something that I've noticed over the past couple of years is we're seeing a lot of RV driving crashes. Where does that get captured? Is that under the heavy vehicles, or is that something different? Because I'm seeing a lot of those crashes. Now, I'm not seeing a lot of injuries or fatalities associated with it, but with all the crashes, that's very high potential for bad good.
Yeah, so I think that the RVs would be incorporated into that heavy vehicle definition. I would have to confirm that. I am not aware of any efforts to look into that on a statewide level. So that's a interesting observation.
And then along a similar line, what about EVs? There's a lot of information out there about how EVs are heavier and cause more damage when they're involved in crashes. Is that something that is being captured at this point?
It has not been to date that I know of, at least not from a VDOT central office perspective.
Is transit being considered separately as part of heavy vehicles, or is it just like commercial vehicles?
No, so the heavy vehicles, there's two different fields in what's collected by an officer that we look at for the definition of a heavy vehicle. One is just looking at the body type itself of the vehicle, in which case a bus would be included in that. But it also looks at whether or not it's a commercial vehicle or not is a separate field, separate definition that gets included.
Two questions. Maybe let me answer them. One of them is railroad crossings, transit button line, are those included in this crash data too, or is that separated out because it's part of another transit accident?
They are included in statewide crash data. I'm not sure if they're included in our heavy vehicle discussion, but I know there's a separate effort that's been going on recently that has been looking at all railroad crossings throughout the state. Okay. So I can't speak very much to that.
Because rural counties do a lot of railroad crossings and so Charlottesville. So that's why I brought that up. And then this is more of the education. Since we're on the slide, we're talking education. As a farmer in the room that transports livestock, whether it's cows or horses, education piece, a lot of people riding right on the trailer, and you cannot slam on the brakes when you have livestock. You can severely injure the animal. And so, from an education standpoint, this is something from farm. We have a lot of farming communities here. Is that educating drivers to provide distance behind livestock trailers, especially getting on and off ramps, or getting up to highway speed, or just turning off to go to your location. I just want to throw that out there. I mean, nothing may come of that, but I think it would be a disservice for me not bring it up.
Can you clarify your question on the railroad crossing?
It was whether or not in all of this data that we're seeing, whether someone was severely injured, or fatality, or whatever, whether that was part of the data as well, or whether because that was more of a railroad separate study that was being separated. Those facts and figures.
So we are supporting VDOT with the statewide at-grade safety action plan. Okay. And so as part of that effort, we do define K crashes and injury crashes, and then prioritize those crossings where vehicles or motorists are interacting with a rail crossing. And so the state has a list of prioritized crossings and strategies to either address and improve those approaches, or completely grade separate those at-grade crossings.
Thank you.
So that is another effort underway.
Right.
I guess the Tom's question is that, and to your answer, Danielle, is that information that can be brought into the study, because it sounds like it's already in the works.
We could talk about it. I'm not sure if the data set you have, I would imagine that it would include it. If there's a crash that's happening on a public road, even if it's at a road crossing, I would imagine that it's part of the data set that Mark is using and referring to. We can confirm that.
Yeah, and I think, as part of this effort, I don't think there's anything preventing us from looking at other plans, studies that are referencing safety improvements. I mean, it's one of our scope items is to look at other studies and plans that have been completed to date to see what priorities they have set, what issues they have identified. And so I think there's value in incorporating any findings from that. I think the question moving forward from an implementation and funding perspective is having an idea for something like that with a statewide plan where they're already identifying issues and a list of improvements. Is that something that you all are then also responsible for incorporating from a planned project perspective, or is that being addressed from the statewide efforts? Because if so, then it may not need to be incorporated into the plan, but it could be.
Yeah, it could be, and I think it's worth acknowledging the other efforts and maybe having a conversation around projects that are being identified and who would maybe be responsible for advancing them forward.
So the last couple, I think we've slightly touched on a little bit here. So we have speeding, roadway departures, and intersections. And then there are 3 others that are on screen. So connected and automated vehicles, emergency response and medical services, and data and analytics. On the statewide level, these are things that we aren't doing data analysis for. We don't really have a lot of, just because there are a fewer number of connected and automated vehicles on the roadway today, there isn't really enough to do comprehensive analysis for that. For emergency response and medical services, there is some data out there related to response times, how quickly people can get on scene, but we focused on these more of, rather than analyzing data and identifying a problem, just recognizing that improvements in these areas are beneficial moving forward, and let's talk about potential improvements. But those are ones that, depending on what you all think, may not be the most applicable for a regional plan. Emergency response, yes, I think that we include in. It talks directly to one of the 4 E's. But the connected and automated vehicles and the data and analytics side of things might be the first 2 to consider removing if they're not a statewide, or if they're not a regional priority to look at.
I know the feds are looking at connected vehicles, particularly at Tesla vehicles, because there's a question of whether or not their detection system is identifying when they come up on a tractor trailer sideways, if the trailer is too high above the road, whether or not it's sensing it. We had a fatal crash up in Fauquier County earlier this year, where apparently a Tesla was in autopilot and it ran up under a tractor trailer. And the feds are looking specifically at that one with other ones across the nation to see if there's an issue with the detection system that's going on with that. So I think you're right. I don't know that we have enough of those here to incorporate it into this study, but I can tell you the feds are looking at it separately. So
Yeah, and to touch a little bit on that, so for the SHSP, right, on the statewide level, the actions that are identified related to connected and automated vehicles are more policy-based, of trying to figure out how do we make sure that VDOT's technology, intersections, pavement markings are all, responsive and can work with connected vehicles as more become available on the market. So it's something that's more policy-based, which tends to happen at a level up, right, statewide level or something like, and so that's, there isn't a lot focused on the technology itself. It's more making sure that the roadways technology is all geared towards to accommodate it.
But there aren't any recommendations that say VDOT should work with localities to do X with connected autonomous vehicles.
I will have to double check. I think no.
I'd be surprised if it were.
Yeah.
I think it's coming, but I don't think they're there yet.
Yeah.
Okay, so we don't have to respond to that quite yet. Locality.
When we do our next 5-year update.
They've been saying it's coming in 5 years.
Yeah.
So I'll keep going here. The next 2 slides have definitions, how we are actually defining a crash involving a young driver, an aging road user. I'm not going to go through all of these. I want to highlight a few just to illustrate some of the differences that you see between them. But this is more just for your reference. If you're, thinking after this meeting, well, what is a roadway departure crash? What is a large truck? This is your quick definition, and afterwards, I'll make sure that we send this presentation as well as a link to the statewide plan that has a little bit more information if you're curious. But a few things that I do want to call out. So there are some emphasis areas where when we are talking about fatalities and serious injuries, we are talking about only a specific user type. So for example, for pedestrians and bicyclists, we are looking at the number of bicyclists that are killed or seriously injured, or the number of pedestrians that are killed or seriously injured. So it is not including any injury that happens to the driver involved in that crash, if that was the case. And it's not often, but there are instances where a driver hits a pedestrian and both suffer a severe injury. So the driver in that case, not included. However, for some of our behavioral type emphasis areas, we are looking at the total number of people killed or injured in that crash. So for young drivers or for impaired driving, right, even if one driver was drunk, if 3 people were seriously injured in that crash, then we are focusing on 3 people. Because it could have been prevented if the one driver wasn't drunk. One other to call out is speed. In terms of how VDOT classifies crash data, a speeding crash is if you were driving 1 mile per hour over the speed limit, or in cases of severe weather or a work zone that has a lower limit posted, it's 1 mile per hour over what the officer reported as the maximum safe speed for conditions. So I know most people have in their head, right, that you can drive 5 or 8 or 10 miles per hour the speed limit and you're not speeding, you might not get pulled over, but in terms of how VDOT considers crash data, 1 mile per hour. That being said, when we look at the speeding data, we'll look at the trend and how far over certain vehicles are to understand if most crashes involve those drivers that are driving 20 over, and we have some data to speak to that.
So how would this study look at speeding? Because it's one thing for it to be driving 1 mile over the speed limit, but the question is, how do you change that behavior? It's something that we have to deal with localities all the time. I mean, the go-to answer is lower the speed limit. Well, that typically doesn't change driver behavior. So I guess the question is, what will you guys be making some kind of recommendation or suggestion to what to do in cases where we have speeding issues?
Speed is one of the, I think, the most challenging aspects to try to address from a crash perspective. And part of that is lowering speed limit can be a consideration. However, if you lower the speed limit and you don't have measures in place to suggest to drivers that they should be driving slower, they're not going to. So typically, if you think about lowering a speed limit, you also want to consider, a road diet or a speed bump, something that is giving them physical evidence that they should be driving slower. The other thing that's tough is one of the things that a lot of the improvements that might be best suited for areas that involve speeding vehicles. So, one of the first things that I think of is having wider shoulders, right, on roadways. Because if you're speeding and you do run off the road, it gives you a larger recoverable area. The challenge is that when you're on a roadway that has a wider shoulder, you tend to drive a little faster. So there's an inherent conflict between improvements that can help reduce the risk of speeding crashes, but they also tend to increase vehicle speed. So I don't have all the answers right now in terms of what we're going to identify as part of this plan. What I know is that speeding is likely going to be an issue that we'll have to focus on. And what we can start by doing is a location-based analysis to figure out, is the concentration of crashes involving speeding vehicles, does that differ from the high injury network overall? And then narrowing down on specific locations to see what we can do. Yeah. But it's a complicated one.
I know. You don't have to tell me.
Yeah.
My question was primarily for everybody else.
Yeah.
Just to be honest.
All right, well, let's look at some of the numbers. So I'm gonna have one chart for fatalities, one chart for serious injuries. And so what we're looking at is the trend over the last 5 years within each of these statewide emphasis areas, but just looking within the TJPDC boundaries. And so what you can see is how these emphasis areas compare to each other and how they compare year over year. So when we are first looking at fatalities, the highest on a consistent basis tends to be your crashes involving a roadway departure. That is something that has been the case on the statewide level as well. And it overlaps a lot with single vehicle crashes involving only one vehicle. It overlaps a lot with crashes involving speeding drivers because they're more likely to leave the roadway, but that tends to be our high water mark for the emphasis areas.
Are crashes counted, or can they be counted in multiple categories?
Yes, they can. Mm-hmm. However, one thing that you see, there's a little bit more variability within the region, but the impaired driving, again, which is those 4 Ds, in 2022 actually had the highest number of fatalities across any emphasis area any year for this 5-year span. One notable thing here, very, very few bicyclist fatalities over the past 5 years. Bicyclist fatalities is also the lowest on a statewide level, but we're looking at only 2 bicyclist fatalities over the past 5 years in TJPDC. It's a very good thing to see numbers that low.
I think we did have some in 2023, at least one.
Okay.
I thought there was one earlier this year, but I don't know if they were riding their bike or if they were walking with their bike, so I don't know how that's captured.
Walking with a bike would be a pedestrian.
Yeah.
So occupant protection seatbelts, is that what that means?
Seatbelts, yep. So that's individuals that weren't wearing their seatbelt that died in crash.
So to that end, one of the things that I was doing when I was reviewing their crashes is I was noting where the position in the vehicle, because seatbelts aren't required in the back seats for certain dangers. Is that something that we can look at to see whether or not maybe we need to start requiring seatbelts in the entire vehicle instead of just front seats? I mean, I know that's a legislative thing, but
yes, we can. I don't know. I'm trying to think of what the data looks like. I know we can definitely separate out the number of instances that were driver versus passenger. Can't remember if the passenger data actually indicates where in the vehicle they were seated.
Treads, it does. I don't know if it does for Power BI.
It definitely not in Power BI.
Yeah.
But we have in RNS, it's essentially pulling over the raw data tables from Treads.
But I know in Treads, it clearly defines where they are in the vehicle.
I'll look into that. Other observations, just in general, about what's occurring in the region. So on a statewide level, I mentioned that roadway departures tends to be the highest, and it is pretty closely followed by 3 other emphasis areas: so speeding, impaired driving, and intersections. There's a little bit bigger of a gap here between roadway departures and the speeding, impaired, and intersection. So impaired has a few years, right, that reach that level, but the average as a whole is decently lower than the average for roadway departures, and then the average for speeding and intersections is even further down. So that's the one thing that is a little bit different than what we see on the statewide level. However, we do see that the number of unbelted fatalities is a lot higher comparatively in this region than what we see on the statewide level. So if we look at serious injuries, you're going to see a similar trend with roadway departures at the top. And we have a similar gap here where it's pretty significantly higher than the other emphasis areas that we are looking at. A couple other interesting trends to look at. We talked a little bit earlier about the increase in speeding related crashes between 2019 and 2020 with fewer vehicles on the road during the pandemic. You can see that reflected between that second and third bar for speeding, but interestingly enough, it was actually higher in 2018 in the region. And in general, I would say across most of these emphasis areas, it is pretty consistent year over year. We do see that jump a little bit or really the drop in 2019 in speeding related fatalities, and that kind of correlates with fewer roadway serious injuries in 2019. But with the exception of on the fatalities, you see a little bit more variability year to year. It's a little bit more consistent on the serious injury side of things. But with all of that, we've had a little bit of this discussion already, but really just wanted to open the floor.
Jump the gun on that.
No worries. To open the floor to ask really 2 main questions. Do you think any of the statewide emphasis areas should be removed from consideration as part of this plan? And then, are there anything that you can think of that are more regional priorities that aren't covered in those statewide emphasis areas that you would like to see considered as part of this plan?
I'll just add on my livestock, transportation, tractors, people riding horses on the road, agriculture. We can just move that under, we have a lot of agricultural communities here. I don't think thankfully, there's not a lot of fatality or injuries as a result of that. But if someone participates in that activity, there's a lot of close calls. So I think education should definitely be a priority to support the agricultural community for those of us that stray in the road, regardless of what we're doing with the tractor, horse, and so on.
We actually received the VDOT's offering the support to 2 other PDCs actively, and we received a very, very similar comment from the West Piedmont PDC. I think they generalize it as just like farm vehicles, agriculture vehicles, and it's something that I need to circle back to see what that data showed. What I think may happen is that there may not be a lot of severe injury level crashes because those farm vehicles tend to be driving at more reasonable speeds. But I think it's something we can definitely look into and see where to go from there.
Thank you.
know, this is the rural transportation, from the urban side of things, we're gonna rely on transit a lot more in the coming years and expanding that. Be good to know where the safety issues are related to our transit systems, so that we're not, overburdening that and relying on the system that has some safety flaws that are gonna cause reliability issues.
Yeah, this might be covered already or captured already in the pedestrian and bicyclist, but related to that, I think one of the pieces of feedback we got for the long range transportation plan is the lack of connectivity between the pedestrian networks and the transit networks. And so if we can kind of capture where that is, leading to maybe some unsafe behaviors, that would probably be helpful. That feels very specific.
And I guess I kind of have a similar question to what I had earlier about connected autonomous vehicles. Is there anything from the state plan in terms of the data analytics piece that they said we should work with localities to improve data analytics in X, Y, and Z ways?
Yeah, so with data analytics, it was, there's two of the acts, so within each of these, right, you establish actions that you try to implement, and there's two that I remember specifically for data and analytics. One was focused on better data sharing between the various organizations that are collecting and managing this data. So, how data transfers from DMV to VDOT. And then there was another that was more focused on Meyer, which is essentially establishing the consistent way to collect crash data. So I don't know if there was specifically something about coordinating with localities, but in the future, what may become apparent is if there are changes to how and when this data is collected, to make sure that there is proper training and sharing of resources to the various police departments from those areas. So I don't know if that was in this plan, but that's definitely something that would be on the horizon moving forward.
Yeah, I assumed that we're consistent in how we're sharing data, but I don't know that for a fact, so maybe that's something we should check into as part of this plan to make sure that we're doing the right data reporting.
How would environmental factors currently be captured? So I'm thinking of things both related to maybe flooding, but also, driving on 64, if you're going the wrong way right now, the sun is glaring in your eyes. I know there are other roads where that's a factor.
I'm not aware of a bunch being
Okay.
looked into for that so far. The one thing I can say is from a crash data perspective, anything related to that is going to be reliant on a crash description, because there isn't anything coded in the crash data related to sun or glare. So it may be a little bit challenging to really understand the full scope of the problem. And I can give you a little insight. We're actually having the same problem right now with crashes involving red light running. So we are looking into trying to figure out essentially what's the scope of the problem for crashes involving red light running. I know from a driver's perspective, I observe it all the time. I don't observe crashes all the time, but I observe drivers running red lights. We are currently looking into how that data is defined, and there is a crash data field that is collected on the driver level related to any improper action, and one of them is disobeying a traffic signal. However, we reviewed crash descriptions on a statewide level looking for key descriptors, ran a red, disregarded signal, and found that if we only looked at that code, we're missing out on probably 30 to 40% of crashes that have a description that lends itself to red light running, even if data fields don't. Unfortunately, anytime you're relying on text fields for any type of data analysis, it's a lot more difficult because there's so much variability, misspellings, different ways of whether you use a or the, and things like that. So that is something that could potentially lend itself to more outreach on the data collection and side of things related to, you know, if there isn't a new change in the form, focusing on more consistent ways that data can be captured and described, and the description allows us more flexibility moving forward.
I want to thank you all for presenting this in a very accessible format to allow this conversation. So I didn't say that earlier. Again, this is a subset of a subset, but we know that there are impaired pedestrians as well. Sometimes that is the cause of the damage. So that's a reality. I'm not sure this is being picked up here in this information. I'd be curious too to know if you were to take a, you know, maybe not quite scientific walkability score and relate that to fatalities for pedestrians. Do we have places where they're perfectly safe and there aren't pedestrian fatalities occurring there, and the majority of the pedestrian fatalities are occurring in places that are frankly unsafe for pedestrians? And that's a road design and a off-road design issue.
But what I say, kind of yes to all of the above for your concerns or question. So I mentioned earlier that there was a big increase in ped fatalities in 2022. There's a big effort right now, kind of driven by questions asked by the VDOT commissioner related to what is happening with pedestrians. And so there has been a lot of data pulled together in the past 2-3 months related to what is happening with ped fatalities. I can tell you that there are more instances where a ped fatality occurred when the pedestrian was drunk than when it was caused by a drunk driver. So it's much more common that a pedestrian is drinking and then you know, dies or is injured in a crash. Part of that, I think there's, in terms of how we look at that in this plan effort, I think we're kind of covering our bases in 2 places, because that data can be looked at in the pedestrian emphasis area and in the impaired driving emphasis area. So I don't think there would be a new focus area, but it could be a way to, 2 different ways to organize thoughts and think about what could be done to address that. And I know I sent it in IM to someone very recently, so I can pull up a quick chart afterwards to show you the percentages of ped fatalities that involve either a pedestrian drinking or a driver drinking.
To that point, Mark, would it be possible for us to look at, like, you know, if the emphasis areas that we advance forward include impaired drivers and pedestrians, which I'm assuming they will, and we identify those areas in the region, could we then see where there are overlaps and then like do a deeper dive into maybe the areas where there's like overlap with those 2 locations popping up?
Yeah, so what I think it's my next slide, 2 slides, we'll talk about all the efforts to still be completed related to data analysis. There's you know, you can dive very deep into data. I've spent a lot of the past couple of years doing that. But one of the things that we will be compiling is a contributing factor chart or heat map that shows how many crashes involve 1 or more emphasis areas. So it will show, you know, the high correlation between speeding and roadway departure, and it will show the correlation between impaired driving and seatbelt use. And so there is a way to look at that. And then we will also have maps that we can pull together that show data within each emphasis area compared to just, you know, all fatalities and serious injuries, to see from a location-based standpoint how that changes.
I have a question about the EMS aspect. It's kind of several parts, I guess, to it, but who is involved stakeholder-wise on that level? I mean, for example, in Nelson County, Augusta County actually provides some of our EMS services, but they're not part of this PDC. So I guess that was the other part of my question, is I know part of the scope is looking at other plans that have been adopted. Is there any consideration for other adjoining PDCs that may also be working on SS4A?
That's not necessarily part of this scope of work. like with the consultants, but it is something, you know, I know several of the PDCs that are also doing this. So I mean, there is some like conversation that's occurring among us, but not to the extent where we're necessarily coordinating our Safe Streets and Roads for All plans. Augusta County is not in a PDC that currently has an active comprehensive safety action plan that they're developing now.
But that being said, I think if the goal of this is to identify, you know, the best improvements for this area in terms of who we are involving in conversations when we get to the point of identifying actions, I do think it would be appropriate to ask then someone from Augusta County to participate in those meetings and those conversations, even if they, you know, aren't physically in the PDC, if they are contributing to responding to crashes, then I think it's apt to make sure that they are part of the conversation.
Thanks.
Any other thoughts or ideas?
I did have one question. You were talking about the red light running earlier. Is that something you're going to be looking at or trying to quantify one way or the other?
We are starting to. I don't know exactly where that is going to lead because what we know is that it's not super well defined in the data, but we're still looking into understanding where it may be more so a problem from either a jurisdiction level comparing, you know, one to another, or even overlaying it against signal data to see if there are intersections that we called out. So all of that's in very initial stages.
I can tell you that we are actually looking at LiDAR-based detection that it has some software that will help identify red light running for us. Now, we're very early in the process. We've seen some demos and we're actually doing a trial run at a location to see how it works. But we've got a long ways to go before we can implement that. So.
Is Stephen Reed aware of those efforts?
We're not advertising it, so.
I won't say anything then.
There will be a time.
Yeah.
But
okay.
At this point.
So Mark, before we move on from this slide, I think you started the conversation asking which of these could be or should be removed from consideration because maybe they're not as big of a focus for the region. I've heard us talk about adding a bunch, but before we move on, are there things that you all see on this list that should not be focused on to the same level, right? So it's a little weird when we say we're not going to focus on something. It's not that we're not acknowledging it, that the state isn't acknowledging it because of the SHSP, but limited time, limited resources, limited staff capacity. Are there any of these focus areas that you all see that should not be the top priorities for this study?
I question connected vehicles. I think it's a little too early. I mean, 5 years from now, if we come back and try doing something similar, maybe then, but I don't know that you'll get much benefit from that in the study.
Everything you're saying, man. I mean, we've been saying it's 5 years away, it's 5 years away, for about 10 years now, so let's worry about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great example.
And I know that older drivers is something that we're looking at, but a lot of the fatalities that are occurring with those is just because their bodies can't stand the impact. I don't know from a study effort what you're going to gain from analyzing older drivers. The statistics stuff. Maybe there's some benefit there. I don't know.
Yeah, and action-wise, it tended to be part education focused. So with older drivers, there are it's more there are certain programs in place through the DMV and other resources that they can understand what is changing about their body and how that means they should sit in their vehicle differently, and you know, things that they are educating about, other resources that are available to them from a transportation perspective. So part of it is to help understand that difference, that their bodies become more fragile and they should be sitting differently and driving less. But
is this study the right place to go into all that?
I think that's a fair question, right?
That's just my thoughts.
I will say that we do have some other initiatives related to aging, and maybe not just, yeah. So this could sort of tie into some of the other initiatives. Lucinda's been working on setting up a mobility management program, for example, which could provide some strong like connection between these two initiatives. If we're sort of saying like maybe there are some considerations as people are aging. So I do think there are some opportunities basically for us to develop recommendations around here. I think if I'm understanding correctly though, is the reason we're trying to maybe limit these to really focus the analysis, like we're trying to sort of narrow this down so we can sort of like focus on which factors we want to understand better before we kind of identify what's rising to the top. Is that what I'm understanding? Trying to simplify the analysis a little bit. Yeah.
Boy, I think it's not just simplifying the analysis, but also simplifying the outcomes as well. So that instead of having a broad range of shallow recommendations, that you have a list of strategies that you can then move forward into implementation that are actionable and applicable to this particular area.
So with that being said, I think priorities for our region are going to vary a little bit depending on if it's rural or urban. So for example, if you're looking especially in the urban parts, you know, even if pedestrians and bicyclists are kind of low in the overall number of injuries, that's really important for our region. So, you know, there could be some differences where maybe one thing is more important to, you know, one or two localities, maybe other localities, something else is more important.
You suggesting like breaking it up geographically, we might not analyze that across the district if there are areas that do that.
Or maybe there's like an urban versus like a urban and rural analysis separate. I don't know. Yeah.
Given that we're working on state streets for all project, I think focusing on the users is probably the wrong place. We should include all of them. And there are going to be pedestrian and bicycle considerations on both sides of it. Those different considerations, but you know, there are still pedestrians and bicyclists in the rural areas. I would think that we probably want to take a second look at the beginning just to make sure that there isn't a problem, but if there isn't, find out. That seems like an easy going through there. And
the other thing, maybe Ben and Albert, you all can weigh in on, is the heavy vehicles, or I know I hear like from every single rural locality that there's a concern about heavy vehicles and questions about that. Is that as much of a concern in the urban areas as well? Okay.
I know we're seeing a lot of trailer crashes here lately. Now, like, again, not all of them are fatal. We've had a handful of fatal ones within the district. Not focusing just on the planning district. But I'm seeing several. Earlier this year, I think we had 64 clogged up with another tractor. So, you know, we're seeing quite a bit of it.
Yeah, we're seeing issues with just internal flow, and so we're talking to the county a lot about the Broadway district area, and that's still a lot of truck traffic going through city streets to get to the county area of the Broadway district. So, it's definitely a major consideration.
And for us, one thing I've noticed so far, and this is happening in Batesville now, is like these cross communities are like, you're having heavy trucks go to these places, which have to go sometime. They're going through them, so a lot of the concern with these large trucks is the safety for Batesville residents. Their biggest concern is having tractor trailers drive literally feet from their houses, where like, you know, kids and stuff are playing, just because it's like, it wasn't built in 1750 to have trucks, and it still is not built now. It's not going to get rebuilt, so a lot of it is just the concern of trucks that close to essentially where people live. So think like Rio and like, you know, hydraulic, there's a large roads, and yes, trucks aren't comfortable on 29, but they're at least built for it. But a lot of it is just little urban pockets outside of our main development area where you have concern. And like it's gonna come up a lot in a few years, but in Jose Park Ridge Road is already been looked at by VDOT because there's a lot of truck traffic that's gonna be using it to go basically from 240 down to 250. And then as more development and stuff come online, all those construction trucks as well will be using that. And this is a mainly residential area. So I wouldn't say around Charlottesville or main problem Broadway is included, but I would say it's those pockets of density out in the county that are the main concern for truck safety.
I guess the question I have is the study is going to be driven by crash data, right?
In public engagement.
Right, it is largely driven by crash data, but one of the major differences, so like, this isn't, if we're comparing to a smart scale, right, where you're developing a project and how many crashes that project has the potential of reducing is a direct factor in the likelihood of that getting funding. This plan, it's incorporating other aspects. So, knowledge of the community, what we hear from the public. So there can be safety concerns that don't directly correlate with crashes.
Yeah, I think that's how ours, I think it's what you're going to see. There's areas he's talking about, you're not going to find crashes there.
Right.
The issues with tractor trailers are on the 64. That's where it is in the Latin Mountain.
A lot of the issues that we have in town with tractor trailers is where they're unloading, because they're parking in the middle of the street. And then there might be some conflicts between pedestrians and vehicles, trying to move that tractor trailer. We don't have a ton of tractor trailer accidents and stuff.
That's frustrating.
Those are more like default trucks that people do that to prevent.
Yeah.
So Ben, were you saying because this is a plan for everyone, we didn't see the need to have specific focus on pedestrians and bicyclists?
No, I'm the opposite.
Okay.
What I'm getting at. I'm saying we shouldn't be looking at that road as things to cut.
Got it.
Because we need to keep all those users in.
And I will add, we do not have to have this fully settled and decided today, right? Take a look. I'd also, so the presentation included the link, but I'll make sure I'll follow up in an email with a link to the statewide SHSP. I encourage you to at least look at it. It provides, getting some context in terms of, and I guess one big caveat is, right, what we don't do on the statewide level is focus on location-specific issues. So when we're talking about intersections as a problem, we're not identifying individual intersections that need improvements in that statewide plan. We're more focusing on, as a whole, we need to make these types of improvements at intersections. That's going to be something that changes a little bit for this, right? For this plan, we can become location specific. We can identify an individual improvement at a location that has crashes, but we can also focus on more holistic things, and skimming through the actions in this plan will give you an idea as to what types of things can be included, knowing that we can get a lot more granular. But any thoughts that you have after, if you take a look at the SHSP, you take another look at this presentation, just send them our way. What I'm hearing now, just to recap, I didn't hear any naysayers about removing the connected and automated vehicles. So from that standpoint, it looks like we'll take that off the table. Potentially can take off data and analytics, but we want to at least spend a little effort just to make sure that we have consistency amongst how that's done in the region. In terms of some potential things to add to the list, agriculture, farm-related vehicles, an emphasis area related to transit improvements, and then potentially, and I guess going back to your question related to sun glare, is there, do you think there would be value in almost having like a weather or environment category as a whole? I don't know if that leads to improvements and potential ways to address it, what our full scope would be
I
there.
think what we did several years ago is we looked at, because on I-64 going eastbound at about mile marker 114, 115 or so, certain times of the year, that sun, as you coming up the hill, it hits you right in the eyes. And we looked at potentially trying to identify the times that occurs and enhance the messaging prior to getting there to let you know, hey, beware congestion ahead, visibility, or glare or whatever. Just now, it never took root, and we never really did it. But we did a study where we recommended doing that. Other than that, I don't know what you're going to do for that type of environmental stuff.
Yeah, I'd add to that the opposite direction. At the same time of year, on half the mountain, towards the top, it's one stretch where it's really bad too. And I've always thought about that messaging kind of thing, it'd be an interesting way of trying, because you see accidents all the time.
Well, the FR300s, you think it's hard to screen for red light running. It's even harder to screen for things like that. Now, what you can screen for is wet road conditions and rain and all that stuff pretty easily. But, I mean, maybe having something for environmental
Especially if we're gonna have qualitative feedback that feeds into this, that might be something that we can capture.
Especially if you interview a police department or somebody like that, and they sort of like recommend something, you might go back and data and look at those spots they identified as problematic. I mean, I drove in Waynesboro for 9 years, and that hill, people were constantly running into each other in the morning.
Yeah.
Additionally to the sunlight and the rainwater, same area, 114 area, it made me think of, what about deer?
Wildlife fencing on that.
Those deer are getting in there anyway.
Well, and maybe this is kind of outside the scope, because maybe this is a little bit beyond the safe systems if we're not talking about like I mean, it's information sharing and education, I guess.
There's a BTRC study out there when they did the deer fencing.
Yeah.
So there is a study out there that they worked on that captures the results from, how they reduce animal crashes due to fencing. I mean, other than that, I mean.
Ben, are you talking about that for 64 specifically, or for other?
Well, just because I knew that the fencing is up on 64, I didn't know if there were any other opportunities for fencing.
We actually discussed it on areas along 29 too, but we're having a hard time finding suitable places to install it. But yeah, 64 is primarily what you would be looking at.
You guys also have some deer reflectors, right? Or some reflectors that you would affix to the guardrail or something, so when you deer in the car, probably out 29, it's city limits.
I don't know about that.
Just like the city limits.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that.
You're talking mirrors for advanced?
No, this was, these were some more reflectors, but I remember, in an elected district a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, that you guys installed some, or considering installed.
Do you have any feedback on like how other areas made these decisions?
The two PDCs that we have met with recently, one just stick with statewide, didn't really come up with anything additional. The other was statewide plus farm vehicles.
Okay.
And work zone.
So maybe, work zone, that's interesting. So maybe I was just asking them but what everybody else was doing, because when in doubt, just do what everybody else does.
I think I got it, that others, one stuck with the normal, just statewide
factors,
and the other one did statewide factors plus work zone.
So they also wanted to consider work zone specific crashes, and they also mentioned the farm vehicle.
Anything like inclement weather, so like for say there's a big storm. I know this because I drive a lot. But like when there's inclement weather, anything can be addressed in terms of VDOT, in terms of road clearance or pre-treatment of roads, that type of stuff. I mean,
Yeah, and I will say I am not going to pretend to be the expert in VDOT's treatment of roads or inclement weather respondents, but I guess I would point the question to ask, is there any value or any improvements that you could see being listed as a part of this plan that could change the way that you go about any of those activities? And if so, maybe we include it. If not, I'm not sure if it's the right fit.
I can tell you that VDOT spends a lot of time discussing that, and a lot of the pre-treatment depends on what the expectations are for the event. If it's gonna start out as rain, you can't really pre-treat it because it just washes your chemicals to the side of the road and you're not getting any pre-treatment. Now, if it's going to start as snow and continue to be snow and you know that, then pre-treatment does have an impact to certain temperatures. Because it's only good for certain temperatures, and it's a very defined process on when you do each of those. I mean, I don't know that there would be anything that would come out of this study that would change the way that they're doing that.
well, yeah, really the whole process, with pre-treatment,
Right.
during the event, and immediately after.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not an expert. I know enough about it to be dangerous, but
Yeah.
it's I know it's very defined thresholds on when you do this, you move on to that, and it's.
Because one thing that does come up in my mind is maybe a potential way where it does fit into this plan is if we could, from a location specific, if we can identify areas that maybe have a stronger pattern of, more specifically like rain or standing water type crashes, that maybe it could lend itself to where we need to reevaluate drainage at certain locations. But what can be difficult with that is that you don't always have a strong enough of a crash pattern. Like you're gonna identify from experience and knowledge of public roads more issues that have a drainage problem than you are by looking at crash data to find out.
I was going to tell you, if you want to know where that is, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
As will the public and anybody
Yeah.
else.
Places.
But yeah, so I think maybe the best path forward for this is to start by not including a weather-related emphasis area, but we can wait, and when we do public involvement, if we find that there's a significant number of complaints related to it, maybe we revisit and go back at that point.
I think we can also look at the high injury network and see if there's something that rises the top through that analysis as well.
Does that sound okay, everybody? Okay. Well, for the sake of time, we have 2 slides left, I think.
Before we move off this, I don't want to derail, but I would just add for data and analytics, we have Lake Arena, which is a seasonally visited attraction. Most of the traffic data counts take place during the school year, which of course is when most of the visitors are not at Lake Anna, which is between June and August. So it's a pretty common refrain that we say that those numbers don't really accurately reflect the actual number of vehicles on the roads with ATs, but also they don't recognize the inexperienced drivers that are on the roads, that are visitors that are coming there as tourists between June and August. So there's a correlation there, and again, it's drilling into the weeds and it's local and it's specific for Louisa County. But I would hate to go through this effort and not mention it now and get down the road and have people push back and say this is a real issue for us.
Well, we have the same thing in the fall.
Yeah, I mean,
Foliage.
yeah, that one or two guys can fix all that. That's good.
Next slide. You see your
Next slide. But it's a data analytics. I would just roll around.
All right, well, let's keep moving here. This is really just not to really focus on this map, more to be a talking point of what's coming next. Because if we're talking about a density map of fatal and serious injury, we're going to see more density in city of Charlottesville and a little bit in Albemarle County, just because of the numbers. But this is more a placeholder to talk about what is coming next. We will be doing a lot of mapping efforts, pulling together density maps, high injury networks that we'll look at both on a jurisdictional level and then roll up into a regional discussion of high crash locations.
So basically, he had that, it's just, so apply for those probably.
Is that, yeah, was one of those hotspots, yeah.
And then in terms of upcoming efforts related to data and identification of problems. So first thing is taking the feedback here that I'm hearing today, going back and starting to incorporate that data for other emphasis areas that we've identified. You mentioned the emphasis area heat map that will help show correlation across the emphasis areas to show which crashes tend to have one or more factors present. High injury network we've talked about already. One thing we have not talked about is VDOT screening level data. So we will also be incorporating PSI, which is potential for safety improvement. So that is a network level, screening level data set that identifies segments or intersections that are experiencing more crashes than you would expect based off of the type of roadway and the volume on it. So essentially, where are segments or intersections performing worse than you would expect? PSAP is the Pedestrian Safety Action Plan. So that is a separate data set that identifies priority corridors that may be apt for pedestrian level improvements. That considers pedestrian crash data, but it does not have to have crash data to be identified as a priority corridor. It could be identified based off of land uses and other factors as well.
In this planning district, though, isn't many of the PSAP corridors right there around Charlottesville?
That is true. There are not priority corridors that are identified in the rural areas.
I didn't think there were any outside of there.
So that being said, though, one of our scope items is that we can revise the PSAP analysis with input specific from this region related to how those factors get incorporated into the priority corridors. And so that will be a conversation to have at a later meeting, but we can talk about how those various factors are weighted. And so it may lead to a slightly different network of priority corridors than what was released on the statewide level.
Yeah, because I know at one time we looked at doing some pedestrian stuff in the town of Louisa, but it's not in the PSAP, so we couldn't use PSAP funding to do those projects.
Other efforts will be incorporating the underserved community data from 2 federal highway data sets. We've actually started to incorporate that already. One other item that we included in our scope is to actually do some site visits with members from each jurisdiction. So once we develop our high injury network and identify either segments of roadway or intersections, to actually spend some time out at those sites with you all to, for one thing, to talk about what might be contributing to factors, but on the other side, there is typically a lot that our teams can learn from being at an intersection and either watching how vehicles interact with each other or how they might interact with a signal or pedestrians. And so, as we move forward and identify those areas, we'll be reaching out to schedule a time to actually go out in the field with you all. And then we did mention earlier that we'll be looking back at previously completed studies and plans to see what priorities were identified from a safety and what solutions were identified. Have those solutions been implemented or funded yet? Are there any troubles getting funding for those, and should they be incorporated into our plan? So one ask that I have for you all following this meeting is if there is anything that you're aware of that you want to send our way to make sure it is included in our list of prior efforts to review, then please send our way.
Do you have a literature review list you've already made, or?
Not yet.
Draft documents.
Sure.
It will be draft for long.
That's something to go back to.
And one other item that I did not include on this list, but I wanted to at least mention is we also included some effort to develop some infographics related to crash problems that can be used in any public materials or potentially released on social media to help either advertise the plan or advertise some of the problems that we are noticing to almost increase awareness ahead of all of the other public involvement efforts that we will be doing as part of the plan. And these are just the upcoming efforts related to data. So there's a lot else that's going to be on the table for public engagement in this effort as a whole, but I'm trying to make sure that the next year and a half is going to go smoothly with this plan so that we're pulling together the best product possible. So with that, so my contact information is on this slide. Stephen and Ryan are the two staff at VDOT Central Office on the safety team that are responsible for offering this support from VDOT to the PDC. So you're also more than welcome to reach out to them with any questions.
Thank you both. Appreciate it. All right, well, we're a little over time, so we're going to move into a very brief, quick roundtable if that works for everybody. I really like to set us up.
I just have a few things for Nelson County. We ended up withdrawing our growth and accessibility planning technical assistance application, which was disappointing, but I think it'll give us an opportunity to provide more education to the public on exactly what it is and what we're trying to accomplish with that. We had our comprehensive plan open house at the end of August. We had between 150 and 200 people come, so it's a good turnout. Overall, the feedback's been really positive, so I'm looking forward to moving around on that. And we're having our next work session at the end of September with the Board and Planning Commission. We've been doing all of them jointly, which is seems to work out. We got the preliminary results back from the Route 151 corridor study. We're expecting the public meetings and survey to be in late October. And then here's my plug. If you are not aware of the Rural Planning Caucus, I'm on the executive committee, and that conference is going to be in October at Mountain Lake Lodge. So it's a really good opportunity for anyone, rural or not rural, to come and get some education.
Thank you. Louisa County, the Planning Commission, last week recommended short-term rental regulations to the Board of Supervisors. We may or not be aware of Amazon's investment in Louisa County for the data center campuses. And I'll leave anything else to the director when we get around the table.
Thanks for letting me come and see this.
Thanks, Troy.
Sure. Obviously, the data centers are going to bring a lot of construction traffic out the interstates, but I'd say related to the role that we were starting out for the SS4A project, we are going through some technical appendices based to our comp plan, which they've engaged the Louisa County Sheriff's Office, Fire and EMS, had a tragedy in the last year with the loss of one of our EMS providers in a single vehicle accident with an emergency vehicle responding to an accident. It's a loss of the Fire and EMS department that we're feeling very sorely right now. But strengthening relationships for our comprehensive plan with the Sheriff's Office and the public schools. And so one of the things we really talk about with stakeholders and stakeholder engagement for SS4A. So we're building some of that right now through our technical work on the methods.
For Fluvanna, I really just wanted to mention that we're finalizing our comp plan for this fall process and updated. Nothing that's really major happening.
I'm kind of the interloper here, but I guess I can give you an update on what the City of Charlottesville is doing. We are currently working through our zoning code rewrite. Our planning commission just had a big public engagement event last week. about 5 hours of public comment on our zoning code. So that's sort of the big show in town. We're also rolling out our 160 projects, mostly paint and plastic bollards for our Safe Routes to School program this fall. We're working on our transit strategic plan with CAD right now. We're also working on an ADA transition plan to evaluate our bus stops and our sidewalks and right of way all throughout town. And this weekend we have a big event with the Fluvanna Trails Foundation in DeVille. So there'll be quite a few people out on the trail, hikers, bikers, runners, some people just piddling around, having fun. Saturday, if you can come out, we'd love to have you. There's also some events on Sunday that are more around the Wool Mill area. So there'll be some trail events, but there'll also be some discussions on transportation topics in the region.
Smart scale, right around the corner, it's closer than you think. The district is going to be reaching out to you all. We're trying to set up things with the resident engineer's office late October to sit down and do the localities. So we'll visit what we might be interested in working on this year. Obviously, some of these things will be highlight star studies, which are points of where you all are working on, but we, of course, Chuck's got his working on his PSI slides, so we'll be going back on publications, potential safety improvements, and I guess we'll also be looking at a lot of the applications that were previously submitted, maybe need to be tweaked, but we're with the goal like we've done in the past of trying to identify projects we want to try to move forward and help develop, try to put them in applications. So be keeping your ear to the ground with that.
The county, we're in the middle of the zoning and comprehensive plan update, so I think next week we go into the planning commission to work on planning toolkits for the comp plan. Otherwise, we're finishing up the prioritization draft process. We're going to go to the board early October to get like feedback on our arrangements for projects so far. The coworker she's working on resubmitting a grant for the Reconnecting Neighborhoods and Communities grant that we applied for last year. And we're close to getting it done. Pete's desk, but didn't get his signature. So she's wrapping that up this month, as well as working on revenue sharing applications as well. And then that's kind of what's been happening so far. No, nothing. Pretty quiet overall.
Cool. Well, so we have been kind of working to incorporate some of the TDP recommendations they made for our Connect routes. So I'm currently working on the Buckingham Connect redesign right now. So we'll be rolling out announcements to the public probably this coming October. And then we'll be moving on to Crozet next. So that's going on. And then we just had our first kickoff meeting for our rural transit needs assessment study, and we had a pretty good turnout. So if you're not involved and you'd like to be, please let me know if I haven't already bothered you with an email. But yeah, so that's what I'm doing now.
The only thing I'll add is that the Commonwealth Transportation Board is picking up the smart scale conversation again at their meeting tomorrow. I'll be following it up. I will do my best to share information out as I become aware of it. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk you through that as you talk about it. But you'll have good support from the VDOT staff as well.
I don't have anything to add. I don't know if anyone online wants to add anything though.
Chuck, what you got?
I'm mute, but I don't have anything. Michael pretty much covered it. Like I said, I've got smart scale presentations I'm putting together. I should be sending them out in the next week or so once we get everybody's review with the PSI locations that we've got from 2021, along with some recommendations. It also is going to outline summary of the changes that are proposed. I think you guys Sandy presented them to you before, so we'll have some of that included in the slides also.
Thank you. Anybody else online would like to add to the roundtable? All right, did we have anybody from the public join us in the meeting?
approved the minutes yet.
Oh, we forgot, thank you. No, yeah, we did, we voted for it, yeah.
Oh, I just wasn't paying attention.
We'll check the recording.
Circle back. Sandy, is there anything you want to talk about? Second the motion. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All right, thank you, we'll see you all next time.
Thank you, everyone. Usually your average presentation.